Hey, it's Kate the Chemist, host of the podcast Seeking a Scientist. I'm coming to Kansas City on March 5th for Big Ideas, a special science event hosted by the Stowers Institute for Medical Research. We'll explore questions like, could plants help solve some of the world's most pressing problems? It's free to come, but you have to reserve your spot. So come with me. RSVP now at kcur.org/events. That's kcur.org/events. See you there.
So, Celia, Western Kansas has a very serious problem.
They've been mining liquid gold, and the vein is just about exhausted.
It's running out of that liquid gold. In plain words, groundwater.
The Ogallala Aquifer. I've been hearing about this since I was a kid.
Right? I mean, take this documentary from PBS in New Mexico. It's 40 years old.
We have the idea the Lord will provide. Well, the Lord, of course, may provide, but at the expense of the future.
So it's been decades now of this message. The water in the Ogallala Aquifer is gonna run out someday.
That is still how a lot of people talk about it. It's going to happen. Except for plenty of farmers, it already is happening.
This is the well that I abandoned in midsummer this year.
So this is Travis Leonard. He's a farmer I met in Haskell County, Kansas.
We started pumping sand. I would unplug the nozzles in the sprinkler. I'd turn around, walk back, and they'd already be plugged up again.
After decades of pumping groundwater, lots of wells are just done.
When I was harvesting that corn this year, it was one of those things that was just, you just took a deep breath knowing this is the last crop that I'm going to have here that had water on it.
So the Ogallala is a huge source of groundwater that farmers in 8 states have relied on for decades. Kansas, Oklahoma, Texas, New Mexico, Colorado, Nebraska, Wyoming, and South Dakota.
Tell us about Haskell County, where Travis lives.
Southwest Kansas, near the Oklahoma Panhandle. Population 3,700.
So that's like cattle country.
Big time cattle country. Cattle by the hundreds of thousands just in this part of Kansas. And we're in the high plains here. So the high plains is in the rain shadow of the Rocky Mountains, meaning those mountains prevent it from getting much rain. So it's a semi-arid region. The grasses are shorter, they're sparser. It's where it starts to transition almost into the desert. So you see, yucca, cacti, and almost no trees at all. So you can see really far.
So this is a very dry region we're talking about.
And quite windy, too.
Growing up here and living here my whole life, I've seen droughts come and go. When they come, it can be pretty devastating.
And this is also where the Dust Bowl hit the hardest back in the 1930s. Haskell County was right in the thick of it. And Travis grew up around people who had lived through it, like his great-grandpa.
When it would get dry when I was a kid, I'd always ask him, Grandpa, when's it going to rain again? He goes, I don't know, but we're a day closer.
It sounds stressful.
Totally. If you cannot tap into the Ogallala Aquifer to water your fields. Back in the Dust Bowl years, the technology just wasn't there. Today, the technology's there, but not necessarily the water. I interviewed Travis back in 2022, which was in the middle of a brutal drought.
This is a top 2 to 3 dry year that I can remember here.
And since he just lost another well, only 1/3 of his family's farmland still gets irrigation.
We're all going to try to do what we can to make this water last, but dry land is the future here. And
dry land farming, growing crops without sprinklers.
Just hoping for rain?
Essentially, yeah, looking up at the sky, hoping nature helps you out, and learning how to best farm to make the most of what little moisture you get. In parts of Ogallala country, you can literally hear the changing times. Farms getting quieter as the hum of irrigation pumps disappears.
This well was close enough to my house I could hear the motor running in the summertime. It's going to be quiet next summer. Here. We won't hear that anymore. So hopefully we hear the sound of thunder and raindrops instead.
From the Kansas News Service and KCUR studios, you're listening to Up From Dust, a podcast about the environmental price of trying to shape the world around us.
And the folks who are rolling up their sleeves to find less damaging, more sustainable ways to fix our generational mistakes. I'm Celia Yopis-Jepson.
And I'm David Kondos. The Ogallala is one of the biggest aquifers in North America. The result of all that water? One of the most important grain-producing regions in the world.
But it's going fast. Many areas of Ogallala country have used up most of their water. Plenty of families, like Travis's, have had to shut down their wells.
And that has high stakes for people living in the high plains, especially as climate change dials up the heat and evaporation there and makes rainfall less reliable.
So today, we're looking at how we got here and what people are doing to try to farm and live in Ogallala country long into the future. Okay, David, before we do anything else, I just want a quick overview. Where do we get our water from in our part of the country?
Okay, so let's start with all the people who are lucky enough to not need the Ogallala.
That's me. I live in Lawrence, Kansas.
Yep, and so you're pretty far east in Kansas, so great example. There's no Ogallala under you. The Ogallala is much further west. And there is other groundwater where you live, like smaller aquifers, but not a massive one like the Ogallala. And anyway, most people in cities aren't really using groundwater anyway. Even the farms in eastern Kansas basically get what they need from rain.
Okay, so when I turn on my tap at home in Lawrence, I'm basically drinking rainwater that found its way into the Kansas River and Clinton Lake, and then to my city water utility, and ultimately to my kitchen sink. Hooray for rain.
Yeah, well, that's lucky for you, but in western Kansas, it's a little bit different. Too little rain, too much evaporation, and the year I visited Travis's farm, the city of Lawrence got around 4 times as much precipitation as some western Kansas communities. And if you just look at the landscape in western Kansas, there's hardly any water. So in Ogallala country, people are depending on the water from wells. Lots and lots of wells, like thousands of straws tapping into this underground storage.
What is this underground storage? Like, what is the Ogallala and where did it come from?
So it formed over literally millions of years. As the mountains to the west eroded, all this crazy amounts of gravel and sand washed down into this region, and over millions of years got buried, and all the kind of gaps between those little rocks filled up with rainwater.
And the key point to know is, this is not a renewable resource.
Yeah, it's actually, a lot of people call it fossil water, essentially, because it's so old. And water can still trickle into the Ogallala. I mean, it still is, but it's crazy how slow it refills, especially when you compare it to how fast we are using up the aquifer. Like a drop of rain that hits the ground in western Kansas can take decades to seep through the clay and the rocks and get down into the aquifer. So when you're in western Kansas, which I used to live and work there, water sustainability is just this dreaded question that looms over everything. It definitely feels like the most pressing conservation problem hanging over people's heads.
It's not a coincidence that Kansas's biggest cities sprung up farther east.
Mm-hmm.
But quite frankly, that leaves me feeling a little bit like the Ogallala. This is not my problem, David. I got my water.
Yeah, and that's, how a lot of people feel, understandably. They don't have to think about it. But my reaction to that would be not so fast. So, whether or not you live in western Kansas yourself, the Ogallala absolutely does affect you. I mean, it shapes the world you live in.
You mean because of all the grain that it produces?
I mean, it goes into a lot of stuff that everybody uses everywhere. Bread, beef. It puts corn syrup into soda. It puts ethanol-infused gasoline into cars. And in Kansas, the Ogallala is fueling tens of thousands of jobs, Celia. I mean, we're talking multi-billion-dollar industries. Take cattle, for example. They're the single biggest part of the ag economy here. The Kansas beef industry generates $10 billion annually. And, what kind of is the foundation of that is the grain. It takes 6.5 billion pounds of corn to fatten up the 2.5 million cattle on Kansas feedlots. And so a lot of the Ogallala water goes to growing that corn.
For people who aren't familiar with western Kansas, we're talking about an area with some of the country's biggest feedlots and slaughterhouses.
So in short, there is no way that this aquifer dries up without shaking up the economy and the crop supplies for this region and beyond. I mean, this water is an economic engine.
But that engine is sputtering. Didn't we see this coming?
So pumping started way back, like 1800s. Old-fashioned windmills, churning up small amounts of water from areas where the water was really easy to get to. Some parts it's just below the surface. People, they dreamed about how much water must be down there. I mean, they thought it must be endless. They were desperate to unlock it on a big scale. Remember, we're talking about this semi-arid region with the cacti and the yucca. And so year by year, decade after decade, the advancements just kept coming. Steam engines, oil-burning engines, diesel motors, rural electricity networks, pumps that could pump up water from deeper and deeper underground. And it also turns out, the second biggest natural gas field in the world is where? Right on the high plains under southwest Kansas. And so it made it more affordable to tap into the Ogallala's depths. And then World War II comes and goes. Mass production of aluminum, which weighed less than steel and meant more portable irrigation equipment. And, by then, if you're a farmer, who would not want this? I mean, these folks have lived through the Dust Bowl. They and their parents had been to hell and back. Thousands of people died. Like, this water from underground was a godsend. By the 60s, 70s, you had better and better sprinkler systems, center pivot irrigation. And they could draw from the aquifer like never before. And that's exactly what they did. By 1980, there were 170,000 wells watering 14 million acres of farmland. It was good for business. Irrigated farming boosted several state economies. Western Kansas transformed from something a little bit desert-like into this national agriculture powerhouse, churning out tons of wheat and corn.
It's like a farming boom.
Yeah, it was a bonanza for farmers and the whole regional economy that mushroomed around that. I mean, you think about all the farm equipment, all the grocery stores, all the banks, everything in these farm towns that was, supported by this foundation of agriculture. And that boom, at the time, it looked and felt stable. But increasingly, as time went on, it became clear that there was a problem, that this boom was kind of perched on a house of cards. And the precariousness is pretty obvious if you look at Western Kansas from really high above. I mean, it looks a little eerie. From an airplane window seat, you'll see row after row of these bright green circles. That's center pivot irrigation. These are the great big fields of crops. And so the yellow land that's around those circles, just outside the reach of those sprinklers, is what the ground looks like without irrigation. And we're talking a very dramatic difference. But Kansas has to face the facts. We're spending down on a very large, but ultimately limited bank account. And that's water that we're essentially trading in today for the food and jobs that we have now.
Okay, so in a matter of just a few short generations, we figured out how to tap the Ogallala, but it turned out that this fossil water isn't endless or even really renewable. How are younger farmers coping who have inherited this situation? Like Travis, for example.
Travis is adapting.
We want to use the water right, and, when we're trying to do that. And,
he's making dryland farming work. Remember, 2/3 of his farm is now dryland. And the 3 decently functioning wells that he has left when I met him.
3 out of how many?
3 out of 16 originally.
Trying to get as much out of the water as we can, trying not to use any more than we have to.
He picks crops to better handle drought.
The milo field here, you can see that was limited water, and the milo does very good with limited water.
That's sorghum, typically grown to feed livestock.
The corn hybrids that I use, I've gone to more dryland type hybrids. I've cut my populations down so they don't need as much water to make a crop, less seed per acre.
And he also avoids plowing the fields as much as possible. Plowed fields lose a lot of the moisture in the soil.
Oh, yeah. Not plowing. This is also called no-till farming. It is a big deal for making farms more sustainable.
And whenever possible, Travis turns off his last few well pumps, too. Just makes do with rain.
But this year, sadly, nobody was able to do that.
In a few parts of western Kansas, 2022 was the driest year since the Dust Bowl.
You can see on the dry land, it just, without water, we don't have anything right now.
And he means that literally. That year, a lot of dryland wheat and corn in Kansas just shriveled up and died. 2022 was so dry and windy and hot that some farmers even lost crops that they irrigated. And I just want to point out that farmers also face some really weird incentives. Like in a year as bad as 2022, it might make sense to stop watering at some point because you know your crop is going to die anyway, so you might as well save some water, right? Farmers are in a bind because crop insurance.
And we're kind of caught, once that crop is in the ground, we have to take care of it. Putting insurance on irrigated corn, they expect you to grow irrigated corn.
And if you don't keep watering it, you might not get the insurance payment if it fails.
So how much longer will there be any viable wells pulling from the Ogallala?
Yeah, so that answer varies a lot across the Ogallala area. Now, some areas you could keep irrigating into the next century, but even they are facing a ticking clock. And as for Travis, he figures his last few wells will sputter out in maybe the next decade or so. He's going to keep farming, but he says it's not easy. And the corn harvest will be smaller.
And I think that in the future, you will see a lot of dryland corn bushels grown in Haskell County, along with dryland milo and wheat. You just know that you're managing for 100 bushel instead of 200 bushel.
He's talking about the corn yields per acre.
Across the road where I've got more water, I'm still growing over 200 bushel corn on that ground. I haven't been doing that on this side of the road for quite a while.
So he thinks lower yields could push some families out of ag, which means even more farm consolidation.
What irrigation allowed was for a family to have maybe just a few quarters of ground and be able to make a living.
He's talking about just a few hundred acres.
With dry land, you have to have more ground to make a living. Economies of scale.
That's hard to hear, David, because honestly, farms have already consolidated so much in recent decades.
That day's coming where you're going to run out of water. It's happened to a lot of people already. It will happen to everybody eventually.
This podcast you're listening to is fantastic, and it's free, kind of. Sure, it doesn't cost you anything to listen, but it's not exactly free to make. Listen, if you're here at every new episode drop, that makes you a full-blown fan. Admit it, you love us. Would you consider turning that kind of love into a financial donation? Please do, and visit kcur.org/support. Thanks.
What I don't understand is why the wells are going dry at different times. Why aren't they all going dry at once?
Right. One well might run dry, even though the next well, just over there, still has water.
Yeah.
Before I moved to Kansas and started reporting on this, I thought it was, maybe one big underground lake, and the wells were, sucking water from the same pool, essentially. But instead of that, one of the scientists with the Kansas Geological Survey, you'll meet him later, likes to describe it this way. Imagine below the ground, it's like an egg carton. And some of the depressions in that carton are really deep, like hundreds of feet deep, full of watery sand and gravel. And others are shallow. And then some, there's just no water at all.
So whether I have water or not is kind of like the luck of the draw, which pocket in that egg crate my farm happens to be perched above.
Exactly. And so we're spending down on this bank account. And there's this kind of general feeling in Western Kansas that is not good. But also, change is hard.
To really simplify for a sec, what about just turning off all the wells while there's still water left to save?
It's easy to say that if you're not a farmer, you don't live in these areas, but that would be a really heavy lift. I mean, it would take major government policy changes in regional economy, in the beef market, and ethanol market, and in consumer behavior, too. Our whole system is honestly kind of set up right now to drain the aquifer. And this is like everything else on the planet that we know needs to change, but somehow isn't changing fast enough.
Just take a look in the mirror and ask, how do you get around town? How do you go to work? You drive a car. And that took oil, that took gas, and that's a finite resource too. It's kind of the same concept.
So that's Brownie Wilson. He works for the Kansas Geological Survey, an agency that actually measures the Ogallala's wells, which I gotta say is a surprisingly manual and time-consuming process. To know how fast the water is dwindling, Every January, Brownie and his colleagues fan out.
You brought the right boots for it.
Yeah. Trudge through snow, in the middle of nowhere.
Little coyote den right there.
Open up wells. And then they drop down these super long steel measuring tapes to check hundreds of wells by hand.
I mean, it's like fishing. Start reeling it back up.
And to give you a sense of just how low-tech this is, Brownie has to coat the steel tape in a blue chalk before lowering it down. That way, when the steel tape reaches the water, the chalk washes it off, and you can see where the water line is.
Okay, you're making me picture like using a dipstick to check my car's oil.
But a 500-foot-long dipstick.
And reeling that by hand? That sounds exhausting.
That wears you out, I'm telling you.
He writes down the water level.
This one dropped just short of a foot.
Preps the steel tape again.
Rechalking it.
Hops back into his truck, checks a map, and drives to the next well. If you spend a day out there with Brownie, like I did, you really start to see why he describes the Ogallala as this kind of underground egg crate, like I mentioned earlier.
How much snow there is on the ground.
I was with him in Wallace County, a little south of I-70 near the Colorado border. And there are areas in Wallace where the wells are running dry or getting close to it. But there's also one pocket of land in Wallace County where there's still lots and lots of water left.
They can pump 1,500 gallons a minute in some spots there. Probably the most prolific portion of the aquifer in all of Kansas. But you drive literally 2-3 miles, you drive right out of it.
That's just what the Ogallala is like. Luck of the draw, where the water is, how much is there, and whether it's reachable.
So we had, 6.69?
Is he like the well police? Like, is he there checking to make sure people didn't pump too much water that year?
No. He's just out there recording the water table levels. I mean, this data is essentially the way scientists know how fast the aquifer's shrinking to begin with. Plus, a lot of the farmers who these wells belong to, they want to know too, right? They're counting on these wells. Sometimes Brownie finds the water table has dropped a lot from the previous year, 10 to 15 feet in a single year when there's been a bad drought, because the farmers have to pump a lot to try to save their crops.
What is that like for Brownie? I mean, if it were me, I would kind of feel like I'm watching this crisis unfold and like I'm there recording it play by play year after year.
I mean, he actually does not like the word crisis. A crisis sounds like it kind of snuck up on us.
We permitted all these wells knowingly. I mean, that decision was made 40, 50 years ago by people who are no longer with us or have moved on. But now we're dealing with those ramifications today.
And humans are draining the Ogallala at the same time that we're warming up the globe, which is bad news. I mean, not every year is going to be a drought like we saw in 2022, but heat and evaporation are projected to get worse in western Kansas. Rainfall could become even less reliable.
Governor Laura Kelly today issued the declaration placing all 105 counties in a drought watch, warning, or emergency. The most severe situations are for the western third of the state.
Kurt says that these soybeans are usually double in size than they are this year.
If it doesn't rain this fall, there's not going to be any, wheat pasture or anything like that to graze.
In 2022, I saw whole fields of shriveled crops that never reached harvest. Corn plants that died just a few feet tall. And it wasn't just dry, it was also windy. So windy, Celia. I mean, that wind was whipping over these bone-dry fields, and that meant dust storms. Those crops, they were just battered, and when that happened and a lot of the crops started failing, ethanol plants and feedlots in this region, they actually had to bring in corn from other places, from Iowa or Illinois or Ohio on trains.
Is there a risk of losing some of the industries here, like the ethanol plants and feedlots? Like, will some of them leave long term if they can't buy as much corn here locally? And if that happens, will western Kansas lose jobs and population?
That's something I asked Brownie Wilson, too. And he thinks that concern should be a good motivation for western Kansas communities to use their water wisely. What are these towns going to look like if the feedlots go away?
To me, that's it. To me, it's the feedlot, the livestock industry here in Kansas. If we can preserve that and rally around that, I think that's kind of our ace in the hole, if you will.
So what can farmers do to use less water?
So some farmers are actually installing these underground systems that drip water directly to the crop's roots. It keeps it out of the sun, so it stops evaporation. But, a vast majority of farmers out there don't have those kind of special systems because they're expensive. Other farmers are getting moisture sensors in the soil so that they can know when their fields need water and when they don't, because it turns out farmers have at times been overwatering their fields. And then other farmers, have been switching to crops that may do better with less water than corn.
Like Travis, right? He talked about planting more drought-tolerant varieties of corn or milo instead. Anything else gaining traction in Western Kansas?
Yeah, so like cotton is an example. But, switching to something new can be a gamble. I mean, remember, corn has tons of built-in demand already in this region. I mean, it has the feedlots, the ethanol plants, and switching to something new can be expensive and risky. I mean, for cotton, for example, you need different equipment, and farm equipment is crazy expensive. All these systemic hurdles are why you see some people advocating to overhaul federal laws, like the Farm Bill, to help the Ogallala. People who think the feds should stop incentivizing so much corn and ethanol, for example, and steer the regional economy in a new direction. Others say states should solve the Ogallala problem, or that local leaders are the best to do it. In politics, all things ag can devolve quickly into gridlock. I mean, there's so much lobbying involved and so much money on the line, but still, something seems to be shifting in Kansas, on farms and in the state capital. And I think that's for two reasons, Celia. The first one is the sheer urgency of the situation. I mean, so many farmers are seeing the impacts. They're seeing their wells dry up. And then two, some farmers are proving they can succeed while pumping less. And their efforts are making more and more people kind of sit up and take note and believe that we can do better. And here's one sign of this. At the end of 2022, the Kansas Water Authority took a momentous vote. They said the state should stop draining the Ogallala for agriculture.
Earth-shattering.
That's Connie Owen, head of the state water office, who was there at that meeting. And that was actually the first time ever that any state agency in Kansas had said anything like that out loud.
And made a statement that we can no longer behave as we have been.
Now, the Water Authority can't enforce this kind of change, but the vote was a formal plea to action to the people who can, to the governor and the legislature.
The people most affected are screaming for help. Irrigators, livestock, feed yard operators, dairy operators. We hear pleading from them, please do something. And they know that they are on the razor's edge.
And they know that some farmers are working hard to use less water, while other landowners show no signs that they're planning to slow down.
There are still individuals that honestly would rather continue to irrigate and pump as much as they can while they can, as long as they can, and make the money they can, and everyone else be damned. And the statement today said no.
And soon after that dramatic vote, the state legislature took up a proposal. And the inspiration was basically farmers. So in Northwest Kansas, some of the folks have been taking this very different approach than a lot of the folks down in the southwest part of the state. And that's especially true in one specific part of Northwest Kansas, Sheridan County, where to a lot of people, there's an area that is the best example we have so far about what it looks like to work towards sustainability. So in this area, about a decade ago, farmers there laid down the law. So they were like, okay, we have a problem and we're all going to cut irrigation by 20%.
Okay, so the first time I read your coverage on this, I was like, the farmers did this themselves?
Yeah, the fancy name for this is a local enhanced management area. And it was absolutely the first one in the state. And so it's like a board of local farmers that are making these decisions. And all the irrigators within this 99 square mile area had to follow the rule. And then researchers followed up to see how it went. And it turns out the farmers there blew past their goal. They cut their water use by 31%.
Wow.
Yeah, and their harvests got a little bit smaller, but also the study found that those farmers came out ahead financially because, pumping water from deep underground takes a lot of electricity. So they saved more than enough money on their energy bills to make up for the decrease in their harvests.
So there are people pushing for change.
Yeah, and one of them is Shannon Kenyon.
Morning, committee.
Who manages the groundwater district in that part of the state called GMD4. She urged lawmakers to pass a law that would push the other GMDs, these groundwater districts, in a similar direction.
So, and per one of my board members, Shane Mann, this is his quote. He says, "There is a viable solution to our problems if we just grit our teeth and have the guts to do it. GMD4 did it and will continue to do it."
And that bill made it to the floor of the House and the Senate, where the vast majority of lawmakers, rural and urban, Republican and Democrat, agreed.
Being a Western Kansas farm kid, I saw over 30 years what the impact of losing water in our region, in the aquifer, has done. We went from having 30 circles of alfalfa down to 16 because we didn't have enough water.
The water belongs to the citizens of Kansas, but those who have that right must take care of the water, and that's what this bill is really about.
I lived on the western side of the state. That's where I started my life, and I've lived on the eastern part of the state most of my life, where we've had plenty of water. When you don't have it, you realize what bad shape we're in.
There's still hope. There's still an opportunity to do something meaningful to save the aquifer for the people in my generation and for the future generations of Kansas. Right now, we're overshadowed by what's happening in the Colorado River Basin, and they are quickly running out of water. So this is a cautionary tale for us in a very real way.
The bill passed.
You've heard the motion. All in favor, say aye. Opposed, no. Motion carried.
So the Republican-controlled legislature handed it off to the Democratic governor, and the deal was done.
Okay, in very basic terms, what does this law say?
So Kansas has these 5 districts that manage different groundwater areas. They're those GMDs we mentioned. And each of those 5 districts has to come up with a long-term action plan. And if they can't get their acts together by July of 2026, then the state can come in and do it for them.
2 years from now, okay, so there's actually a deadline to do something?
Yeah, and so that's a reason to be hopeful. But, we also need to inject some realism here, too. So, there's no guarantee that it will lead to truly sustainable plans. Even some of the law proponents are pretty worried that, lobbyists could derail the whole thing.
Will the state really hold GMDs accountable to improving?
Well, the politics have always been tough. Over the decades, Kansas governors have been pretty hands-off about this, Republicans and Democrats alike.
Touching people's water access is like a political hot potato.
Hotter than the surface of the sun, Celia. Yes. Yeah. And that is not going to change. That is still going to be the case. And, even if someday there is a mandate for farmers to reduce their water use, it's still a complicated issue of how to do that, because let's say hypothetically the state says everyone needs to cut water use by 10%. Well, 10% of what? If that's based on how much water a farmer has been using for the past X number of years, then that might reward some farmers who have been using water willy-nilly because their baseline water use number is going to be higher than folks who have been trying to find ways to conserve voluntarily. And so this is just an incredibly thorny issue. And so, could the state step in and slow the depletion? Yeah, sure. But will it? I don't know.
Yeah, to me, the Ogallala really feels a lot like global warming. Most of us know it's a problem now. A lot of us feel a significant amount of anxiety about it and worry. But more or less, we just kind of plow ahead, keep living our lives the same way, and hope that a fix is on the way.
Yeah, no, I think there's a lot of truth to that. And actually, Kansas State University surveyed more than 1,000 farmers across the Ogallala region, and 80% of them said, yeah, it's important to save the Ogallala, save the aquifer for future generations. But in the same survey, most of them did not feel personally responsible for depletion. And among farmers that irrigate their fields, only 20% felt like they should cut back personally on their water use.
I think wrestling with responsibility is tough, David, for this and for many other environmental issues. What's my responsibility? What's someone else's responsibility? So before we go, there's one writer who's done a lot of reflecting, specifically in the context of the dwindling Ogallala, on his family's own history with it and on what can be done next.
I'm Lucas Bessier, author of Running Out in Search of Water on the High Plains.
So if after this episode you want to learn more about the Ogallala, look this book up. It was a 2021 finalist for a National Book Award, beautifully written. So Lucas is an anthropology professor at the University of Oklahoma, and he grew up partly on a farm in southwest Kansas.
That farm has been in my dad's family for a really long time. One part of his family goes back 5 generations in southwest Kansas.
His dad still lives on the family farm, cattle ranching, doing some dryland farming, doesn't irrigate, but does have a permit to irrigate. So around 2016 or so, Lucas learned his dad is worried about the Ogallala drying up and what it's going to mean for the area. So the two of them started exploring the topic together.
And that turned into this 2-year off and on journey around talking to different people.
2 years of crisscrossing Western Kansas, talking to farmers, local officials, state officials, and the folks who run the GMDs, those groundwater districts that we talked about. And at the same time as all of this, Lucas also explored his own family's story.
My great-grandpa was one of the early proponents and advocates of deep well irrigation in southwest Kansas.
Right. And he was one of those people who started pumping after the Dust Bowl, right?
Exactly. He survived the Dust Bowl.
A lot of people left after that, and some of them stayed, and he stayed.
And in the 40s, he started pumping. And like a lot of families, then recovered from the Dust Bowl and thrived.
I feel like he was definitely a man of his time. He was a successful agribusinessman of the 1960s and 1970s in southwest Kansas.
And he had a daughter, Fern, a very tough, smart person who was Lucas's grandmother. And one day at the family farm, Lucas found all of these documents stashed away that Fern had collected. Newspaper articles, clippings, handwritten notes, local groundwater measurements. I mean, she was interviewing farmers about their wells drying up. He's pretty sure that she was planning to write a book about the Ogallala.
She never had a chance to write that book. So when I discovered those notes, that's when I finally decided to write the book.
Yeah, so he's kind of like carrying on the family torch of this research that his ancestor was doing.
Yes, and in the process of Lucas kind of documenting what she was doing, I feel like I learned a lot. So for example, Fern was trying to figure out where a local spring had been, one that she knew was really important historically, but that had vanished.
Yeah, I think that Fern was concerned with trying to understand the fate of these legendary waters in southwest Kansas. You know, you go to the site of these springs, which nourished communities of all kinds for a really long time, and there's nothing there.
So, David, this goes back to what you were talking about earlier. When you're in that region and driving around, you just don't see much water, right? And then when it rains, the creeks flow temporarily again, but then they just disappear. A few short generations ago, there were all these bodies of water that were there 12 months a year, and they're gone now.
And I think that it's useful for all of us to stop and pause and note those sites as a place for reflection about what's going on.
Those springs and creeks back then were actually fed by the aquifer. Like, in the simplest terms, think of it as places where the aquifer was brimming over, like spilling up from underground, giving us precious, amazing surface water in a semi-arid region. But we've just used so much of the aquifer underground that it's not brimming over anymore.
Yeah, it's not just impacting these wells. It's impacting all the water.
So we're not just making life hard on ourselves long term, we're making it difficult for wildlife now. But back to Lucas. Like I said, he and his dad talked to a lot of people. And what I want to highlight from his experience is this.
I was unprepared for the real range of perspectives voiced by irrigation farmers.
Yeah.
He kind of breaks it into 3 groups.
One group was the hardcore, water miners that were in it to get rich and get out. That was a small group of people. Then there was a small group of people who were really committed to a more sustainable relationship to aquifers that were trying really hard to make those changes necessary. And then there was the vast majority of farmers who didn't want the water to run out. They would like to save some of it for future generations, but they felt compelled to continue by various kinds of financial structures and histories and imperatives.
Yeah, and that's something I heard from folks when I was out there reporting too. I mean, it's a very kind of personal thing, kind of what you think about it and what you think about your impact on it.
To Lucas, it's really important to recognize this complexity in Western Kansas and all the possible reasons for it.
I had, maybe like other people, imagined that most of the farmers and most of the farmland was in relationship to local community-held family farms. And it turns out that that is not the case.
He was really surprised when he realized that nowadays, a lot of the land use is steered by corporations and people who don't live in the area.
And in the area just around my dad's place, a large percentage of the land is owned or controlled by absentee or out-of-state landowners. And those landowners have a different relationship to making decisions about how the water is used.
If water runs out in this region, some of those corporations, honestly, they can probably just shift their investments elsewhere. But what about all the families that are worried and who want Western Kansas communities to thrive long into the future?
We have to give people a chance to make this a business that can work over the long term. And I think that's what people are asking for, actually.
There are still a lot of families like that with intimate ties to the land, some of whom, as we heard, are effectively banding together and starting to enforce really meaningful water limits in their areas.
And that's one of the most amazing things about the work in Northwest Kansas, where you have a GMD that is mostly run by family farmers who are putting reductions on what they do.
GMD4, we heard from them earlier.
The one making progress that's kind of become the blueprint for this new state law we talked about.
It's not enough for zero loss irrigation agriculture, but it's a big step to extending what can be done in the future.
I'm curious, what did Lucas think about that new law that we talked about in Kansas, the one with the 2026 deadline for making groundwater districts come up with these long-term plans?
I think he sees opportunity. It's not simple and it's not clear-cut and it's not easy, but it's vital that we figure it out because there are ways to build a brighter future on the high plains.
There's things that are happening, and I think that's reason to hope. It's really easy to throw up your hands and give up on this issue. But the truth is that the most effective response is for more people to get involved, especially people in our rural communities. If you're concerned about groundwater use and the future of the aquifer, you need to make yourself heard. We all have to look for ways to move forward.
Up From Dust is a production of KCUR Studios in Kansas City and the Kansas News Service, aka the NPR stations of Kansas. KCUR, KMUW, High Plains Public Radio, and Kansas Public Radio. Up From Dust was reported over the past 2 years. This episode was reported by David Kondos and written by me, Celia Yopis-Jepsen. David now covers the environment for KUER in Utah. Mackenzie Martin is our senior producer. A heartfelt thank you to the KCUR crew, Suzanne Hogan, Byron Love, Celia Morton, Anna Schmidt, Gabe Rosenberg, Stephen Cranda, and Genevieve Demarteau. And I'm definitely grateful for Brownie Wilson's help and the book Groundwater Exploitation in the High Plains by David Crom and Stephen White. Our beautiful podcast logo comes from the mind of Jessica Corneliuson. You heard odds and ends from the 1981 documentary The End of an Aquifer, Everyday Cinematic Sounds, WIBW, and KWCH. Music provided by David Condos, Tom Lonnie, Milktooth, and Blue Dot Sessions. Are you enjoying Up From Dust? We're so grateful if you can share this podcast with your friends or leave us a review, and thank you for listening. This episode, we learned all about a major challenge for water supplies in western Kansas, but actually, eastern Kansas has its own water problems to deal with, and we'll learn about that next month.
Scientist Kara Achenbach spends her days with reindeer herders, studying how their bodies adapt to the cold.
The population here seems to use more fats. And when I say use, this is not conscious. This is what their body is doing on its own.
I'm Kate the Chemist. Learn more on my podcast, Seeking a Scientist, made possible by the Stowers Institute.